Hey everybody, we are going to actually finish up all of the new content with chapter 55, and we're going to be looking at conservation, biology, and restoration ecology. So just a quick overview. Um, 1.8 million species have been named and described. Okay, so that sounds like a lot, but biologists actually estimate that there are 10 to 200 million species that exist on Earth. And tropical rainforests contain some of the greatest concentrations of species, and they are being destroyed at a pretty alarming rate. Okay, so humans are rapidly pushing lots of species towards extinction. So those are just a few things to kind of keep in mind as we go through this unit. And if you take a look here, you are looking at deforestation. So conservation biology seeks to preserve life, and it integrates things like ecology, physiology, molecular biology, genetics, and evolutionary biology. And one really important thing to think about when we talk about conservation biology and restoration ecology is how human activities threaten Earth's biodiversity. So rates of species extinction are difficult to determine under normal conditions. The high rate of species extinction that we see today, though, is largely a result of these ecosystems around the world that are being degraded by humans. So humans are truly threatening Earth's biodiversity. And when we talk about biodiversity, we are going to be talking about three main components. So genetic diversity, so the diversity is sort of within the genomes of all of the individuals of a species, species diversity, and then ecosystem diversity. Three major threats to biodiversity are going to be habitat destruction. So when we go in and we build a city, or even just building a single road destroys habitats. When we introduce new species into an area, and then overexploitation. So when we remove individuals from an ecosystem to the point where we drive them towards extinction. So habitat loss is when humans alter the habitat, and this is the greatest threat to biodiversity throughout the biosphere. And in almost all cases, habitat fragmentation destruction leads to a loss of biodiversity. So a really great example is here in Illinois. Less than 1/100th of 1% of the original prairie is left. So Illinois is supposed to be the prairie state, but we have this tiny, tiny fragment of prairies that are actually left. And then if you wanted to look in other areas, coral reefs are another really good example. So about 93% of coral reefs have been damaged by human activities. Here we are again looking at just, human impact. So you're not supposed to have, these wonderful little roads and all these homes running through mountain ranges like that. Next, we have introduced species, and these are those that are that humans move from native locations to new geographic regions. Without their native predators, parasites, and pathogens, introduced species may spread very, very rapidly and start to take over almost entire ecosystems. Introduced species that gain a foothold in a new habitat can just cause huge devastation in the new community. So here, a really good example in the US is kudzu. So this happens in the south, and like anything that's standing still long enough can get covered by this plant. Next, we've got overexploitation, and this is when humans harvest plants or animals at rates that exceed the ability of the populations of those species to rebound. A really good example is overexploitation by the fishing industry. So the slide is talking to you about game fish like tuna, but you guys know I worked in Alaska. And this is what I did. I lived on the fishing boats, and I was monitoring the catch data and collecting the catch data so it could be sent to the National Marine Fisheries Service so that they could very tightly regulate how many fish were being caught and at what rate and what kind of fish in order to close the fishing seasons and in order to keep the Bering Sea fishing industry healthy so it didn't collapse because that's pretty much what happened out east. So population conservation focuses on population size, the genetic diversity, and critical habitat. So biologists that focus on conservation at the population and species level will follow two main approaches, so the small population approach or the declining population approach. With the small population approach, you're going to study processes that can make small populations actually become extinct. And we talk about something called the extinction vortex. And when you have a small population, it's very prone to positive feedback loops that draw it into what we call this extinction vortex. The key factor driving this is the loss of genetic variation that allows populations to evolve, to environmental change. So here is a diagram that kind of explains this. So if you have a small population, that small population is going to experience inbreeding and genetic drift. Both of those lead to a loss of genetic variability. When you are not having enough variation within the population, you then have a reduction in individual fitness, and then the population is not going to be as able to adapt. So then you're going to have lower reproduction and higher mortality, and that leads to an even smaller population. This kind of keeps going on and on and on, and this is what we call, again, the extinction vortex. So another great example in Illinois was the greater prairie chicken. So the populations of greater prairie chicken were fragmented by agriculture, and after a while it was found that they exhibit decreased fertility. So to test this extinction vortex hypothesis, scientists brought in birds from other populations, from larger populations. And actually what happened was the declining population rebounded, and has confirmed that low genetic variation has been causing an extinction vortex. And so this is what we are looking at here. So again, we've got the number of birds. This is the number of male birds. You can see it is steadily declining. And then here you can see this is where the translocation took place. And then what happened then after that is the eggs hatched increased. The next approach was the declining population approach. This focuses on threatened and endangered populations that show a downward trend regardless of population size. So they could have a fairly large population, but the trend is downward. So this emphasizes the environmental factors that would cause a population to decline. And then the declining population approach is going to involve several steps. So first you actually have to confirm that the population is in fact in decline. You then need to study the species' natural history. So you need to know, where does it live, what does it eat, what does it use, what does it prey on, what preys upon it, and develop a hypothesis for all the possible causes of the decline. Then you want to test these hypotheses in the order of likeliness, and then apply the results to the diagnosis to manage for a recovery. So an example is the red-cockaded woodpecker, and then these woodpeckers require trees in mature pine forests, and they have a very complex social structure. So you have a breeding pair that would have then up to 4 helper individuals, and this species was forced into decline by habitat destruction. And so what you're looking at here are 2 pictures of forests. So this is what a healthy forest should look like. So you notice you've got a lot of really tall mature trees, but not as many lower trees. And then when you look at the second picture, you've got very dense, high undergrowth, and that tends to be indicative of a much more lower quality forest. And so this is what the woodpeckers needed, but this is what a lot of them were living in, and that's what caused the decline in population. One thing that's really interesting when we talk about all this, like conservation biology and restoration ecology, is that a lot of times you have to weigh conflicting demands. So conserving species often requires resolving conflicts between the habitat needs of the endangered species, but also the human demands. A really good example is in the US Pacific Northwest. So habitat preservation for a lot of species is very much at odds with the timber and the mining industries. And so you have to find solutions that will help preserve these species, but at the same time, are reflective of human demands on that space as well. So managing habitat for one species, though, like interestingly enough, actually has positive effects on many other species, but it could also have negative effects on other species. Something else to keep in mind is establishing protected areas. So conservation biologists apply understanding of ecological dynamics and establishing protected areas to slow the loss of biodiversity. And much of the focus is on identifying biological hotspots. So what is a hotspot? A hotspot is a relatively small area that has a really great concentration of endemic species, and many of those could be endangered or threatened. Biodiversity hotspots are really good choices for natural reserves because you're going to be preserving a lot of species all at once, but identifying these hotspots isn't always easy. I will say though that it tends to be an area, you can see here, a lot of the areas tend to be closer to the equator, and a lot of times islands as well represent biodiversity hotspots. And keep in mind, the orange areas on the map are going to be the terrestrial hotspots, but there are also marine biodiversity hotspots as well, and those are indicated by the blue triangles. So, restoration ecology then attempts to restore degraded ecosystems. So, we talked about conservation biology, but now restoration ecology, you're trying to restore ecosystems. So, the idea is that given enough time, biological communities should be able to recover on their own from many types of disturbances. And so, restoration ecology seeks to either initiate or speed up that recovery. And like one of the basic underlying assumptions is that most environmental damage is reversible, all right, at least up into a certain point. And two key strategies for this are bioremediation and augmentation of ecosystem processes. So here we're looking at a restoration example. So you can see this is 1991 before the restoration. It looks very, very different. So a lot of plants have been brought in and then trying to restore the function of that wetland. Bioremediation is the use of living organisms to detoxify ecosystems. The organisms that are most often used are prokaryotes, fungi, or actually plants as well. So these organisms are important because they can take up and even sometimes metabolize toxic molecules and break them down so they're not harmful. The Sustainable Biosphere Initiative is all about using sustainable development, and this is going to be development that meets the needs of people but doesn't limit the ability of future generations to meet their needs. And so the goal of this initiative is to define and acquire basic ecological information for responsible development, management, and conservation of Earth's resources. A good example is in Costa Rica. So Costa Rica's conservation of tropical biodiversity includes partnerships between governments and other organizations. And what's interesting is that human living conditions in Costa Rica have actually improved along with the ecological conservation. And so two really important measures of that are looking at life expectancy and infant mortality. And so you can see here the infant mortality has decreased quite substantially, and life expectancy has also increased quite substantially. So your lecture question for today, in your own words, can you please explain the difference between restoration ecology and conservation biology? All right, guys, please don't forget to send me a message via the class website. Thanks.